Okay, good morning everybody. Welcome to this week's Keeping in Touch seminar. I think it's, as I said, about the 6th or 7th we've been running, and you turning up, so I'll take that as a compliment. Chris, we might mute everybody. I'll mute all except me. So I'll do that. Okay, everyone can still hear me? Raise your hands, please. Yes, great. Thank you. So, as I said, today's, I think, the 6th or 7th we've run of these. As always, more than comfortable taking your feedback as we go along, and there'll be some functions in there. Today we're going to talk about virus and markets, as always. I've done a little bit of work looking at where Australia sits in the world economy, and I was actually delighted to find a few interesting facts that just reinforce my view that we live in the best place in the world. I want to spend a little bit of time learning or revisiting things that you know and your parents knew, that I'm not sure our kids and our grandkids are going to be overly skilled at, and that's old-fashioned management of money. I don't like the word budgeting. We'll talk about that. We'll take questions at the end. As always, we're trying very hard to get these things below 20 minutes, but I'm talking, so that's almost impossible. If you do have any questions, look at the chat icon in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen and just pop the question there, and Chris and I'll make sure we answer it as we go along. If you're having difficulty because of the internet connection, try turning your video off, and it'll just increase the amount of bandwidth available for audio. As always, we're recording this. I've pressed the record button already, so it'll be available. I must confess, we're finding that we're getting a lot of views. We're getting, you know, we're up around 500 or 600 views on the YouTube channel. So that's kind of cool, Chris. We're actually, I think you can almost define us as influencers if people are watching that many of our videos. I will have to try to start selling something, but I'll take that as, again, as a compliment that the content's of value. Please feel free to share them with your kids and other people you know, because I'm trying to make this stuff as relevant to you as possible. And the media has its agenda of scaring you, and most people, when they put things in writing, they end up saying it in such a complicated way that the message is lost. So if this is helping you and you find it might help a friend, please share. As always, today is a general conversation. Whilst we try to make it as relevant as possible to everyone here, it is not personal until we tell it to you face to face or in writing. And as such, by all means, chew on it, think about it, ask us questions, but don't act on anything until you've spoken to us. So previous webinars, and they're all available online. We've reviewed the various government stimulus options there. There's been some interesting things happening with superannuation access. And I think some of you may have seen the behaviour of the ME Bank recently, which I find quite surprising. We'll maybe touch on that later. We'll look at global economic indicators. China's such an important part of what's going on. The London interbank overnight rate is really important. It's basically a confidence measure between the banks. It's still low, continues to be low. So the international financial system has a lot of confidence that money's going to keep moving, which is what caused the Great Depression 100 years ago. The banks wouldn't lend money. So, you know, that LIBOR rate, I know it sounds fairly technical, but it's a really critical rate to keep an eye on. And Reserve Bank economic outlooks and things like that, we're going to cover that again today. So just a quick one on the virus. I'm getting this data from the health website, the health.gov.au website. Numbers are looking good. There are 28 really sick people in this country, which is about 1 for every million people there are in the country. That's how few people are truly ill with this virus. There are only 70 people in hospital in the whole country. Our testing rate of 650,000 people that thought they might be sick with this thing, only 1%, or about 6,500 of them, actually had coronavirus. So these are great figures. So current status of things is we've had 95 people lose their life, which is terrible. But when you compare it with, say, the flu or any of the other things, you know, the actions the government have taken has been very positive. Vast amount of people are recovering. Some people are still on the way. I like to just check in with last week's figures as well. So there's only 105 new cases in the country this year. there's only 12 people died in the last 7 days. Sorry, 105 more cases this week. Only 12 more people died in the last week, and a lot of those are people in nursing homes, and we've all seen those stories online, and people are just getting better quickly. I like this bell curve. It shows very clearly that from around about the middle of March, the end of March to the middle of April, we made a profound difference in the frequency of infection. Now, this little tick up at the end that we've got here is, to me, an indication that there's a lot more people being tested, not that there's a lot more people getting sick. I think the sickness rate's about the same, but what we're finding, if you've been looking at any of the figures that Gladys Berejiklian puts on the TV every morning, you know, the rate over the last few weeks in New South Wales is about, for every 1,200 to 1,500 tests that are done of sick people, one person has the virus. So this thing is well and truly under control. Obviously, the government's going to be cautious about releasing restrictions, because we have seen what's going on in other countries where they were a bit more lax with it. And I find this graph's quite an interesting one. If we look here at Australia, you know, envy of the world. South Korea, I believe, is pretty good. I'm not 100% convinced that China tells the truth on these things, so I'm going to let it go. One of the things I find interesting, not just the infection rate of the United States, that's obviously terrible, but we're seeing the infection rate in Europe flatten. I think this is the UK rate here. The bit that is most interesting is Japan and Sweden. Now, both of those countries chose not to put in place the social distancing rules. Now, the social distancing rules effectively, by trusting the population as they did in Japan and Sweden, their infection rate was significantly higher. Now, Sweden only has 10 million people in it, yet it's got the number of infections in Sweden is about 5 or 6 times higher than they are in Australia. Japan is a far more obedient country than just about anywhere else in the world, but their infection rate's still a bit higher than us, although they do have 6 times as many people. So it's important when we're looking at these graphs that we understand these are log scales. Now, a log scale means that's 1,000, that's 10,000, that's 100,000, that's 1,000,000. So the gap between 10,000 and 100,000 is actually quite huge, but it doesn't look like that much. But this is where the gap between Sweden and Australia is actually quite significant. Sweden's got 4 times as many, 5 times as many people infected with half the population. So that decision that they made not to put these social distancing rules in place, you know, by this sort of metric is showing that it was actually maybe an error. But in any event, it's looking quite good. These are figures for the entire state of New South Wales. Some great figures in here. If we look at things, the infection rate on average in New South Wales is about 37 people per 100,000 and about 1.2% positive infections when tested. When you look at the Hunter Valley, our infection rate is one of the lowest in the state. It's not quite the lowest in the state. Most of those are the more remote areas. So if you go right out to Broken Hill, there's hardly any people that run into each other out there. But when you compare it with any of the populated areas like Sydney and South and North, the Hunter Valley is actually one of the safest places in New South Wales to be, which I think is a great thing. We've got one of the highest test rates, but particularly the bit I like is that the rate per 100,000 is actually really quite positive as compared to places in Sydney and so forth, which is significantly higher. So again, a good place to be, this country, this town, this region. World, excluding China, the infection rate is now up at around the 5 million people, I believe. The infection rate per week is still quite high. That's what this figure is here on the left, 500,000 to 600,000 people per week. The rate was trending downwards here, as you can see. It's taken a little tick up here at the end. Again, I put that down to better distribution of testing kits and things like that. But we're seeing everything behaving itself. Now, what we've seen with the bell curves in the rest of the world is that that should do this, which means within a matter of 4 to 8 weeks, we should see quite a strong control of this virus, which I think is a very positive way to look at it. Okay, stock markets, again, quite positive yesterday. It was quite a good day. I have no idea what caused this blip in the middle of this last week. Stock market took off and then went down again. It's gone up again now. So we're seeing exactly the conversation we've had over the last few weeks, that we really don't know what's driving this per se. Just the thing to know is that 80% of stock market trading is done by computers. So if somebody looks left, the computer picks up on it and says, oh, that means everybody's looking left, and all of a sudden that's what's going on. So recognize, please, that there is an awful lot of energy driven by incredibly fast computers buying and selling things here, trying to make money on a half-hourly basis, whereas the way we all grew up with the share market was it took weeks and months for information to affect the market. But what we have seen for the last few days is positive. The minute that the market gets a whiff of positive news, it wants to recover, and that's good for you as an investor. As I've said before, all the spending that the government's going to be doing over the next 2 or 3 years isn't going to be great for wages growth. So your kids and your grandkids financially may struggle a little bit to get an improvement in their wages, but it's going to be good for the share market and therefore good for every investor, which includes all of you. So maybe you'll be in a position to help the kids out if that's the way that dice rolls. But we're going to see recovery in the market. My gut instinct here, if we look for the month, again, it's inherently positive. My gut instinct here is the minute that the curves show that the virus is under control and they start to announce antiviral measures that are effective, we're going to see stock market recovery. I suspect by the time we get towards Christmas, they're going to realise that there's an unemployment problem and that's going to take a little while for the market to drag itself out of. So I suspect Christmas and into the new year, you're going to see the market decline again. But then all this government stimulus, this $5 trillion that's being spent around the world to create economic momentum again, that should kick in within the 12 months, if not earlier. And you're going to find strong recovery out of China, strong recovery out of Europe, strong recovery out of the US. And they're going to do everything they can to support world trade. I suspect that we're going to find a fair amount of goodwill coming from the corporate sector as well, because at the end of the day, they need the economy to be ticking over so they can sell us things. One has a hope that we're not going to see a whole lot of military intervention and activity because, to be blunt, I don't think we can afford it. There's some interesting figures which are about to start to appear in the media. Now, the International Monetary Fund, which is a great big UN-sponsored organisation that lends money to countries, has forecast these kind of fairly nasty negatives in 2020, averaging around the -6. China has got positive 1.2% forecast. Australia is pretty much taking it in the neck with a 6%, 7% negative for the year. I think that's probably not unreasonable. But off the back of the recovery in China, they're forecasting a very strong recovery in Australia. Now, in itself, that kind of is a little bit depressing because a -7% in the economy is actually quite a nasty shock. And so I went looking elsewhere, and this is a consensus of about a dozen economic organisations with lots of letters after their name and lots of status, right? And their view is inherently a far less negative than the IMF on Australia and China. They're actually suggesting China won't grow quite as much, but nor will Australia in 2021. But what we're seeing here with a -1.8, well, that's just a recession. And that's not even a particularly nasty one. Certainly nowhere near the 7% return, which, now the thing you need to understand, Australia's economy is about $1.4 trillion. So a 10% drop, which is $1,300 billion, a 10% drop in the economy represents $130 billion drop. So this -7% here represents about $100 billion reduction in the amount of money flowing around the economy. Call it the economy's income. I would much rather have a 2% reduction in the economy's income. That's 260 billion. Now, the government is going to spend somewhere in the order of $400 to $500 billion in this country stimulating things. So if we're seeing a 130, hang on, I'm losing my numbers here. If we're seeing a $260 billion reduction down here with this lower consensus, then the government's going to spend more money than is going to be coming in as an economic downturn from this activity. So that is inherently a really positive thing to see. Up here, 7% is $100 billion. Hang on, I'm losing it again. 7% will be more than the government's planning on spending. So I'm seeing here this FactSet consensus as a very positive sign that the economic impact is going to be a little less than perhaps what the media is going to be reporting. The one thing you can guarantee is the media is going to look for the most negative figure to put on the board. And again, you know, I think everybody here knows my definition of a terrorist organisation is someone that sets out to scare you and modify your behaviour. So you can put Al Qaeda in there, right up there with Channel 9 and Channel 7. I really, I wish that they would be more considered at times about this. But the numbers actually aren't bearing out some of the hysteria that they're wanting us to see. So here's some interesting figures. Now, I hope you can forgive me, I'm a numbers guy, but these are really interesting data. So the column on the left are the top 13 countries economically in the world. Now, given the size of our population, for us to be a number 13 country in the world economically is actually a terrific place to be. So the Americans are the largest economy in the world with $21 trillion. That's $21 million is their turnover. There's some really interesting figures in this graph. Firstly, China exports more than anybody in the world. Now, this was the origin of Donald Trump saying to China, well, we'll just put barriers up if you're not going to play fair. China needs the rest of the world more than the rest of the world needs China, right? With the possible exception of Australia in that space. So China exports $2,800 billion of stuff to the rest of the world. And if any of this stuff that's coming up about China misbehaving with the way they reported the virus, if they don't cooperate with the rest of the world will simply turn its back on China a little bit, and that will hurt China. It really will. They need this international income. The Americans are the #1 economy in the world, both in terms of size of their economy, their gross national income, but also their income per person is actually the highest in the world, which I find very strange given that there is actually a lot of poverty in America. What thrills me to my core is this number down here. Australia is the second richest nation in the world per head of income per person in the world. This is not the cheapest country in the world by far, we know that. However, I didn't expect to find that Australia was better than Japan and Germany and France and Italy and Canada. You know, it was an absolute thrill to find that we are, you know, America first, Australia second, and to be honest, there's a country mile between us and Germany, who's the third richest nation per person in the world. I also found it very interesting to see where Russia sits in the grand scheme of things. For the amount of international impact that Russia has, they are seriously only just a little bit bigger than Australia as an economy, which is a fascinating figure. But you realise that they are actually per person they only have resources of about 1/5 of the average Australian person in terms of their wealth. And actually, this is their income, not just their wealth. So I find this whole graph, this whole table really fascinating because it allows you to see, yet again, we've got the best graphs in the world in terms of this COVID-19 response. Our government has been intelligent and responsive. The Labor Party hasn't chosen to make an ass of themselves. So this has been a really concerted support for the national agenda from the politicians, which is delightful. And it turns out that we're going to have one of the most muted impacts in the world. If you come back to these graphs here, the rest of the world, Australia, if you look at the big ones, Australia has the smallest economic impact of anybody. and as a result has a more muted recovery. But when you realise that our health and our wealth is actually right up there, I just say it time and time again, there is nowhere else I want to live than right here. And as much as I don't 100% agree with every decision the governments have made, I support the fact that they've got to make them, they've got to take them, and it's working in our favour. So this is an interesting chart. This is me just playing with my numbers, and it's I just got to get this thing going. Nope, I've gone back one too quick. I just want to see if I can get this going. Hold on. I don't want a pen, I don't want a laser pointer. I went to a lot of effort to get this video going. Here we go. So this is a graph of the income per person from the various countries over the last 200 years, basically. Australia started really near the bottom, but very quickly became just about the wealthiest country in the world per person, dancing around with the United States and the United Kingdom. Russia's been through hell. China was nowhere for quite a long time. And now we're seeing in the 1970s and 80s a great economic recovery, leading to, yet again, Australia having a really preeminent position in the world economy in terms of our wealth and our health and our medical system and the way we care for our aged people and educate our children. Now we're seeing a rapid recovery or a rapid growth in the income of China, which on the surface looks a bit of a worry, but you've got to realize that these, again, this graph is a log graph. It's exponential. Every graph, every time we go here between 16,000, sorry, I'll go back one. Highlighter here. This is 16,000 per person, 32,000 per person, 64,000 per person in terms of income. So when we look here, we're seeing some negatives around World War I, a result of the World War I. Again, a bit of a blip associated with World War II. Up here, we see a tiny blip associated with the global financial crisis. But what we're seeing right now is evidence that, again, I'd rather be here than anybody else, to be blunt. Australia has maintained for 200 years or 150 years its preeminence as one of the best places in the country, in the world to live. And even though China looks like it's growing quickly, it is, but its income is still only a third per person of what Australia's is and close to a quarter of what Americans per person is. And the issue that this curve from China has to start to roll down. It's very difficult for China to keep its growth going the way it is. But again, the benefit of this curve here is that they buy a lot of their oil and their minerals and their food from us. So that's one of the reasons that we've maintained our position over the last 10 or 20 years when the rest of the world struggled with this GFC kind of consequence right here. So I hope that's of interest, but it just thrills me to keep discovering I live in the best place in the world. Okay, so I see all of that as an inherently positive story, not that we're not going to have a few collywobbles over the next year or two, but we are. What I want to talk about is something that I think as a skill, maybe our kids and our grandkids have lost. And I was talking with my daughter this morning, as I said about this earlier, and her view is that kids don't understand the value of discipline the way that you and I were taught. You know, our parents and our grandparents went through the Great Depression and they had no choice. They had to be disciplined. And there's some really good numbers here. If your kids and your grandkids can learn from the difficult period we're going through. So I just want to talk about some basic ideas around how people control their money. So we'll just look at this scenario where mum might have 2 jobs and dad has 1 job. Mum's money goes into a bank account here. Dad's wages go into his bank account and he might be leasing a car, right? Now, mum's got a couple of online, some of these online accounts that pay a slightly higher rate of interest. There's 4 credit cards there as well, so it's all good. Mum manages the money, so she takes the money out of the working account and puts it in the e-saver account for a few weeks until she pays bills at the end of the month. And then she also pays credit cards from those accounts like that. Now, at the end of every month, she's got to shovel money back across to the working account so she can pay these bills. Dad pays the mortgage, but from time to time has had to redraw from the mortgage so that they can take holidays and buy cars and whatnot. Now, we have to buy food and fuel, so that comes from the Visa cards from time to time, but also from cash drawdown, FPOS sort of thing. Now, occasionally the Visa cards are maxed out, so they have to use Dad's MasterCard or his Amex card. Of course, we need a little bit of cash, and that comes from those bank accounts. Now, we do have to pay the bills, which for the most part come from the credit cards in one form or another, but also from the working account as Mum pays the bills. Now, I don't know about you guys, this is starting to look a little complex, right? Now, it hasn't finished yet by a long way. So we've got to take a holiday, and we tend to use Dad's Amex for that because we get points. Okay, you want to get the points. The points are good, love points. Of course, we also use our Visa card and take cash to pay for some of the things we do on holidays, so that's all fine. Mum and Dad, in a desire to get ahead, decided to buy an investment property, right? Now, the mortgage gets, because Dad has a higher income, the rent is for Dad, like Dad owns a house and gets the tax deduction for it. Rent comes into his account, but the home loan repayments go back into his account as well, or come out of his account. Now, that doesn't mean, ignore the motorbike for a second, from time to time they spend money on the investment property and they use a credit card for that so that they can track it, right? And they've got evidence for the accountant. Now, of course, over on the left-hand side, every so often there needs to be an emergency spending on something that wasn't planned. I don't know, let's call it a BMW R1200 GS adventure. And if you think there's a bit of a Freudian slip there, you're right. And that spending might come out of Mum's account, of course, even though Dad's motorbike, of course, it comes out of Visa accounts, and it might be a new piece of furniture, it might be renovations on the house, it might be a holiday, it might be a car for their daughter, it could be anything. Now, I defy anybody at this point to tell me what they've spent on bills or food and fuel or what the investment property costs. There are going to be the 1% of people that can actually figure that out because they love spreadsheets and that's what they do for a hobby. But that means 99% of people don't really know. Does this sound familiar to anybody? We've seen our kids do this, or at least some people we know. So in my mind, and we've done a lot of work with clients over the last 20 years with this, the problem isn't people's spending, the problem is their behaviour. So we want to introduce a notion here, and there's a bit of parallel here between the Barefoot Investor, if any of your kids are reading this book, but I will say that this just plain works. When you look at what people spend money on, it falls into 5 categories. The first category, the bills, just go ahead and pay them, right? You might as well just pay them, you're stuck with them. Anyone sends you an invoice for electricity or telephone, you know you're going to have to pay it eventually. So put the money aside and pay it. The weekly spend is the food and the fuel, going to the movies, going out for a drink, kids' sport. You don't necessarily have to go out this week, but you probably will next week, and you certainly will be topping the fuel up in the car the week after. So there's inevitability associated with the orange expenses or the weekly spend. Where most people get in trouble, time after time after time, where people get in trouble is the irregular spending. The spending that they didn't know was going to happen a month or a week or 6 months earlier. This might be a renovation on the house. It might be furniture. I actually bought a motorcycle the other day, which is why the motorbike's there. And I'm seeing Ian listening there, mate. We've been talking about this. I actually went and bought the motorbike. The irregular spending is the unplanned spending. Now, we also pay mortgages off and we have investments, and those things tend to be standalone as well. So a far better way to manage our spending is to look at the way we spend it rather than what we spend it on. Now, in this example, and this works like an absolute treat for myself and for any clients that have taken it on, it has worked a treat. We generally say, okay, put all the money into a hub account. If there is a mortgage, we would generally have that offsetting the mortgage. We set up a bills account. We might put $400 or $500 a week into the bills account, right? We set up weekly accounts. This will be for mum and dad. In my case, so some couples have all their money in one account, and that works fine. In my case, my wife and I decided we wanted to stay married, which means we had to separate our bank accounts. And I get $100 a week and she actually gets $1,000 a week to run our family. That apparently is fair. No one's ever told me, well, no lady's ever told me that it's not fair. And we're doing it, it works separately that way. Now, we call the red account a Christmas club account. That's basically money for those inevitable lumpy things that are coming your way, such as kids' clothing or a holiday or whatnot. Now, if we have debts, pay them out of the hub account. They're black. We don't want to know about them, to be honest. We're just going to set up a payment schedule and away we go. If we've got a regular investment plan in place, then we just do the same thing. We just put X amount of money away into that account or into that set of shares or that property or whatever. Now, down here in the bills account, typically we establish direct debits out of this account. Now, many of you will remember what I'm talking about here. This is effectively grandma and the envelopes. Take money, put it, like Dad comes home with a pay packet, grandma puts money into each of the envelopes, and she never takes money from the wrong envelope or the wrong jam tin or whatever. So if we've got bills, put money in the bills account, give it a float and arrange all your bill payments out of there. In this case, Dad presses the savings button on his credit card and that accesses his account, right? Mum may ask him to go to Woolies and whatnot, and so to do that, he may actually press the check button on his credit card and he accesses Mum's weekly spending account. Now, I actually had this functionality for myself before my wife actually took it away from me, because what actually happened was, when we first set this up, within the first couple of weeks of setting it up, Angie asked me to go to Woolies and to buy some bread and milk or what have you. And I thought, while I was there, I'll actually buy a few extras here, there and there. And I've been given permission to buy $30 worth of stuff, and I spent $150. And when I came home, she looked at me and said, "What's all this extra stuff? I asked you to buy 3 things." And I said, "Oh yeah, but we needed meat, we needed this, we needed that." And she absolutely tore skin off my back. She said, "What did you buy that for? That was my money. You spent my money doing that." And I said, "Oh no, but we need it." And she said, "No, you've taken money away from me. You've disenfranchised me, is that the word? Or anyway, disabled me from doing this." And I actually thought about it and thought, she's actually right. We had a plan in terms of how we were going to use this money, and I broke the plan. So I took the groceries back to Woolworths, and the manager at Woolworths is a client of mine, and she said, "Gil, we normally don't take groceries back, but because it's you, I will." And I said, "Actually, no, Olga, no, I actually should own this a little bit." And she took back some things, but effectively I came away with about $100 worth of gear. And I actually took $70 out of my bank account and gave it to my wife, because I spent her money in a way that was unintended. Now, the key point here is that we have a consequence associated with spending the money, and that's the piece that matters. So in Mum's case, she may press the savings button to access the groceries account, or the check button is the button she pushes when she's going to buy clothing for the kids or whatnot. Now, I don't know if this is sort of gelling with you, but it really is the old-fashioned way of managing our money. And if we know where the money is for buying groceries, and we go to that account, we take the money out, we buy the groceries, and when there's no money in the account, we wait 2 or 3 days because there'll be another $800 coming in. Now, for our kids, for the most part, I know most of you personally, so I'm not judging you, because I know most of you don't. You have good control of your spending. But our kids don't, as a general rule. Our kids generally just spend money based on how they feel. And as a result, they're constantly surprised why their debts aren't going down and why their situation isn't improving. So we need to create a consequence here. And this consequence is quite clear. I stand at Woolworths. Which account do I take the money out of when I'm buying the groceries? Or I'm going to the movies. Which account do we take the money out? If we're going to buy a new car, where is it coming from? We need to know how it affects things. And the beauty of this is we don't actually need to run a budget to understand how our spending is going. So if we started with, say, $1,000 in the account, and 6 months later we've still got roughly $1,000 in the account, then that means what we're putting in is equal to what we're spending. Does that make sense? If, on the other hand, we found that the bank account was going down, then that tells us we're spending more than we're putting in. Now, we've got a choice at that point. Just an old-fashioned choice. Do we tighten our belt, you know, or do we actually top up what we're spending? Now, I don't mind, in fact, I don't care if you need to spend $25 a week or $50 a week on coffee. I kind of get the addiction. I'm not far off it myself. What I'm interested in is whether that budget is allowing for it or not. In the ideal world, the graph heads north and you've actually got a little extra cash because you're saving a little more than you're spending, or you're spending a little less than what you're paying yourself. And at that point, you can either dial down the weekly transfer, or you can just say every 6 months, I've got an extra $1,000 to spend. It's entirely up to you. But I know from personal experience, if you know that you've got a float of $1,000 or $500 in your account, you tend to modify your behavior. You tend to think twice before you spend a little extra money on taking the kids to the movies or shouting pizza or what have you. That actually does change everything. So I ran some numbers just to prove the point. Actually, before we do that, we often get the question about, what about the credit card points? Aren't the credit card points? I'll put everything on my credit card. Does that not justify having this central spending where there's no difference between my bills, my spending, and the new television I have to buy? So in this instance, I looked things up. I said, right, imagine we're going to buy an iPad. Right? I can buy it in 3 places. I can buy it on Flybuys. I can buy it at JB Hi-Fi, or I can go and get a gift card and use it wherever. So in this world, and this is pretty much right, every dollar you spend on your credit card gets you 1 Flybuys point. An iPad, sorry, costs you about 100,000 Flybuys points to buy. JB Hi-Fi costs you about $500 to buy it, which means that 1 point is worth roughly 0.49 cents. Or every point that you have is worth about 0.5%. Now you contrast that with the gift card, which is worth, surprise, surprise, you spend 10,000 points, you get $50. It's about 0.5%. Right? You compare that with the 10 to 30% of spare cash flow that people discover when they create a different banking structure, so that they know when they're standing at the point of sale, they know which account to take the money from. And if there's no money in that account, they just don't buy it at that point. We've done this so many times with clients, it's proven itself beyond a shadow of a doubt, that you will find between 10% and 30% of your cost of living, 10 to 30% of your cash flow will suddenly appear in your bank account if you rearrange the banking structure in line with the way we talked about. And that simply swamps the credit card argument. As much as a credit card is very convenient, and there's nothing wrong with getting points, if you don't know where your money is coming from, and you don't know whether the credit card account is, whether you've overspent your agreed amount for the week, you will spend more than 0.5% extra on your credit card. They've proven that. That's why they sell credit cards to everybody, including my 14-year-old daughters at the moment. So does it work? Just give you an example. We'll just look at my 2 favourite clients, Mark Knopfler and Shania Twain. Mark earns $85,000 a year. He's in sales. Shania is a nurse with 2 or 3 kids at home. She's earning $50,000 for the next few years, and then she's going to go back to work on a full-time rate. 2 kids, $400,000 mortgage. They got to pay about $500 a week on bills, $600 a week on food and fuel and kids' sports and things like that. They're paying $26,000 off the mortgage. They'd like to take a nice holiday every few years. I don't care whether it's every 2 years or every 3 years. And they generally would buy a new car every 8 years or so, and Shania is due for a new one in about 5 years' time, according to this model. So they're not particularly expensive spenders or rich, but I ran some numbers, and this is a really interesting analysis on what happens if you can control your spending. And this, to me, makes all the difference in whether your kids are going to end up with a fantastically bright future or a more modest, difficult future. And given that I think we're going to see a lot of difficulty with wages growth over the next 5 and 10 years in this country, controlling spending becomes really important. If you can't grow your income, then you've got to control your spending. So this graph here The blue line is a graph of their net assets. So that's all their cash, their shares, their super and everything like that. So if Mark and Shania earn their money, spend the amount that we showed you on the previous slide, and they just save a little extra, then their net worth over the remainder of their life from 37 to about 60 odd, they're going to be worth about $1.5 million as a retirement nest egg, which is a terrific outcome. If on the other hand, they do what they've been doing for the last 10 years and simply spend everything they earn, so they've committed to their mortgage and they pay their bills, but they've got nothing left at the end of every month, then their financial outcome is far worse. It's about $700,000 worse in today's money, which is over $1 million in future dollars. Now, this is evidenced best when you look at their mortgage. So this thin blue line is their mortgage dropping from $400,000 down to zero over the next 10 years. If Mark and Shania only pay the minimum on their mortgage and keep doing what they're doing in terms of holidays and cars and spend everything they earn, then they won't have their mortgage paid off until Mark's 65. They're still going to be able to retire on $800,000, but it'll be a more modest retirement, and he'll be forced to keep working till he's 65 to get there. Now, this is a really interesting graph when you look at it, because for the first 5 years, because Shania's only working part-time in this story, they're actually only $7,000 a year better off. That they're saving it and they're putting off their mortgage, obviously, but it's only a modest amount. But what they're doing for the next 5 years is building some really good habits. And when she goes back to work at this point, all of a sudden those good habits really pay dividends. And over the course of the next 5 years, they basically get to a situation where they've paid their mortgage off, which is $200,000 better than had they kept their bad habits. So in this instance, this kind of good cash flow management stuff we're talking about can make a profound difference to the point over the retirement story where the next, what is that, about 14 years, that's 14 years of mortgage payments that Mark and Shania aren't making, which they're putting into shares or they're putting into property or they're putting it into super. And as a result, they end up with a tremendous retirement nest egg of 1.5 million instead of a nest egg of 800,000, which is purely super, because all they've done is spend their money. And what it really means is they could, if they wanted to, retire a little earlier. Shania might decide to only work 3 days a week instead of 5. Mark may take ill and take a less stressful job. But good habits built in now, when we're in a period where wages growth is going to be difficult, can change everything in our kids' lives. And this is one of these sort of reset moments where it doesn't matter what they want to do, they have to manage their finances a bit better. If you can help your kids to really see this as a learning opportunity, and please share this particular video, which is why I've put this one in today. I just thought if your kids are struggling a bit financially, I can guarantee you, if they restructure their finances, they're going to find that there will be a profound difference, even in the short term, in the first few months. But over the long term, it'll just change everything. And it really comes down to money management skills. And it's great that we're a wealthy nation. It's great that we've got a high income, but that income is not really going to grow much over the next few years. So we need to use this opportunity to learn some old-fashioned skills from our parents and our grandparents about how to spend less than what we earn. And if we do that, it just changes everything. So this is a chance to take questions. Chris, I'll bring you back in if you're there. I'll unmute you. You can do that yourself, but as I can't see any questions from anybody, has anyone got anything? I'll look at the chat. No. Is there anything anyone would like to ask? I can unmute you, or you can type it in if you wish. I might unmute everybody. Chris, we'll take a guess. I hope that's been of value, everybody. Is there anything that you wanted to ask, or are we happy to finish on that note?
Happy to finish on that note.
All right. Well, yep. Thank you very much for your attendance. As always, please give us a buzz, give us an email, knock on the door if you've got any questions about things. We're a lot of us are still working from home, but I suspect over the next week or two that's going to change. We will be spending more and more time in the office. The office is still open. A couple of the staff are electing to work there because it's more peaceful at work than it is at home. I love this quote. You know, it's not the facts you know, it's what you do with that information that changes everything. So knowing that I like coffee isn't the same as knowing how much I can afford to spend on coffee. Just to reinforce that. And I know that virtually every client has said, yes, we understand, we've got to remain invested. We've shown you enough information over the last couple of weeks, or a month or two. Most portfolios are holding up really quite well. The more growth oriented, the more you've suffered, obviously. But if you look at the 12-month figures, they're generally far less scary than people thought they were going to be. So in this instance, I wish you all very well. We've got no questions coming through, so take care, God bless, and we'll speak to you next week.